But I think living in an unconsequential mind frame is acting like a child. I think only children act that way. And I think we're grown-ups. So why not think about the consequences and the spillover effects of our actions?
Welcome to Engines of Creation, the podcast about the art and science of mastering complexity to build the systems that shape our world. I'm your host, Cristian Mastrodonato. The voice you just heard belongs to Alexandra Deschamps-Sonsino. Alex is a true pioneer in the design and technology space. She was a key player in the early maker movement, helped bring the Arduino platform to the UK, and created the Goodnight Lamp, an early, deeply human piece of ambient computing that now sits in the permanent collection of the London Design Museum. She's also the author of the book Smarter Homes, among others. But we aren't here today to just reminisce about the early hype of the Internet of Things. We are here to talk about what happens on day 1 million. In the tech world, we are obsessed with the shiny launch, the initial scale-up, and removing all user friction. But as we discussed, when we remove all friction, we often design away human agency. In this episode, we take a hard look at the philosophy of creation. We discuss why the current generative AI boom is treating the general public like an unpaid user research experiment, how smart home technology can unwittingly become tools for control if we ignore the dark side of the use cases, and why the future of innovation isn't just about customer delight, but about the right to repair and maintenance. If you are tired of the move fast and break things narrative and want to understand the deep, systemic consequences of what we build, this conversation is for you. Before we jump in, if you enjoy these deep dives into the art and science of managing complexity, please take a second to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app and share these episodes. This is truly the best way to help the show grow. And now, let's go! Welcome, everyone, to Engines of Creation. And I'm very happy to have with us today Alex Deschamps-Sonsino. And we're going to cover a lot of ground around innovation and what innovation means from different perspectives. And so, welcome, Alexandra, to our podcast.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Alex. I am a consultant. I've worked across a lot of different things in design and tech and innovation, but for the last few years have taken on that design, tech, innovation lens in climate work. And so I've taken on a lot of different roles, but have worked across the Internet of Things, climate change, tech ethics, and then some. So that's me. I'm based in South London as well, which is also always nice to imagine someone based somewhere in the world as opposed to a floating head.
Actually, your last comment, it's a great connection to a lot of the things you did in your career, which is also that human element that comes in technology. It's something that I definitely came across many times, working and also interviewing designers in this podcast. And it's something that fascinates me, probably because as a technologist, I tend to be maybe naturally more attracted or have worked more on the pure, we can call it techie side of things. But actually there is a social side of things. And you definitely covered a lot. So I would like to start talking a bit more about the beginning of your journey as not only as in the sense I would say as a designer, but also as a builder yourself. You've been part of the maker movement, as far as I can understand. You've been, if I remember correctly, the importer of the Arduino board in the UK. And for the listeners who don't know what Arduino is, but I think it was the very first open source hardware platform available that people could buy. It was very cheap and everyone could install anything and could configure and expand in many different ways. And also when you started working in the Internet of Things, you created your own product, which was the Goodnight Lamp, which was a very interesting product. I'll ask you a little bit more without giving any spoiler, but your take on what you launched and why you launched that. And kind of also you wrote a book, which was Smart Home, which we're going to get possibly a little bit later. So let's start from the beginning, as someone would say. And I'm really curious to understand how things have changed from those initial days of Internet of Things, your experience on the Goodnight lamp, what worked and what didn't, your experience with Arduino. Think that feels like those years were very engaging and there were a lot of ideas and a lot of promises.
So the Goodnight lamp came out of my master's degree in Italy, actually. I studied in a short-lived institution called the Interaction Design Institute Ivrea, which is in Piemonte, so it's north of Turin, very close to where the Olympics are being held, of course. The idea was kind of simple because the brief at the time was simple. The brief was an academic brief for master's degree students. So the brief was, imagine the world when people are living more on their own, which we now know has happened, right? A lot of folks live alone. And I came up with the idea because at the time I was recently an emigre to Italy from Canada where my family was. And I came up with the idea that if you gave someone a little lamp and you had a big lamp, if you turn the big lamp on, the little one comes on no matter where they are in the world. As a very simple ambient computing kind of way of saying, I'm around, I'm available, or I'm thinking of you. And so that synchronicity of two people on two different time zones connecting over a very simple gesture of turning the light on. That's what I came up with. And I was, a student working with the first Arduinos because they were being developed in the Institute. We were prototyping this, and it was a very, raw prototype. And this is 2005. So I hadn't graduated yet. And, I just presented it to the owners of the brief, which at the time was Droog, so Droog Design, or Droog if you're Dutch, so that I don't get comments in the about that, is a Dutch design institution. Now that's changed quite a bit, but at the time was really a pioneer of critical design, you could say, and critical industrial design. They had set the brief for us as students, so they'd approached the institute and set the brief. Sat on the idea in terms of commercialization because they had the first right of refusal to commercialize it. They sat on it for about 6 months, eventually decided not to go forward with commercialization, and it sort of came back to me as a student. The institute, oddly, also was shutting down, which meant that from an IP perspective, I could sort of leave with the idea, which often if you're in academia now, you don't really have that environment. And I, held it close to me for some time without really doing anything about it. And only years later in 2011, I suppose, 2012 maybe, decided, hey, this is still an idea I like. It's still an idea that people respond to. Why don't I try doing something about it? And then entered a more classic, you could say, startup phase of trying to fundraise, making the first units, making them with the technology that felt right at the time, which was EG, and tried to commercialize it. Ended up making a few hundred units, commercialized it up to that point, which you could say is a form of commercialization. And that lasted for some time. And then I had to wind things down in 2019. Nothing to do with the pandemic per se, but just to do with the kind of commercial reality, which was the product was very expensive to make, very expensive, therefore, to sell. There was no SaaS model that I could imagine that kind of belonged to that sort of interaction without corrupting it somehow. And so the economics of it just simply didn't add up. And that remains something that I'm disappointed in, of course, but in a way I learned a lot, and I learned a lot and lessons that I can kind of take to others now when I mentor them or when I support them when they have startups of their own. Nice thing that happened as part of it was that it was added to the London Design Museum's permanent collection as an example of the Internet of Things. So it's sort of hung there in their permanent showcase. You can go see it on the second floor if you're in London, and that I'm really proud of.
Well, yes, of course, as you should be. And what I always found very interesting personally about the Goodnight Lamp is one of those rare occasions, not only in IoT, I would say in technology sometimes, where the focus is on intimacy, is on connection. There is a social purpose, and it's not something that is obvious, first of all, and you attach to the SaaS model. And there is, I would say the complexity is often into bridging the social impact of whatever project you're trying to do with the business side of that. Can I make a sustainable business model out of that? And I don't think we can call it social entrepreneurship, but the fact that this product was so much focused on this more human side is something I always find very fascinating from the first time I came across. And so I'm not surprised it ended up in a design museum in that sense, because it is a very nice example of proper design. One thing I would argue, though, is there were a lot of ideas at the beginning of IoT. It sounds like the industry shifted a lot towards data harvesting versus the original idea was actually providing lots of value to the customers, which I think is also your original product idea was behind, okay, we can connect things which are very far, and it means connecting people. And it doesn't look like that's the case anymore. Sort of the IoT industry shifted more really on getting data versus delivering value. Am I wrong, or do you think actually I'm too negative and some of those original promises have been fulfilled?
I think mixed results, right? So I think in any industry that is nascent, because the engineers listening to this will say, well, there's always been sensor networks. Absolutely, 100%. Since we've had forms of connectivity, we've had sensor networks. But the Internet of Things, the word things being more of a consumer lens, I think any attempt to shift into a consumer space is going to encounter a lot of friction, and it's going to take decades. It's not going to take 1 or 2 decades. It's going to take 3, 4, 5 decades. I wrote a book that you mentioned earlier. I wrote a book called Smarter Homes, which looks at the history of smart homes as a genre. And, it took decades for people to electrify their homes. It took decades for people to adopt central heating. It took decades for people to eventually get broadband at almost 99% of homes in the West, at least. So it will take decades for these possibility space and this space of connecting people socially in unusual ways, or connect behavior in unusual ways. I think it'll take decades for that to become something that we're very comfortable with. And I do think it's also very cultural. So people adopt technologies in different ways in different countries. For example, I think the Italians were the first ones to adopt mobile phones, especially multiple mobile ownership, far quicker than most people in Europe. People had 2 to 3 mobile phones very, very quickly, whereas others sort of stayed with one for a long time. So I think it's all about taking your time. And I think those early ideas are really useful because they put a stake in the ground or a flag somewhere to say, wouldn't it be nice if? And they create the possibility space. And then you have a number of different companies that can try and, like mine, fail perhaps, but they're still describing a new territory. And that's, I think, useful for others. An example of this in the community, because I've been running the London Internet of Things meetup since 2011, which is a small design studio run by Avril and John Nussey, ran a smart doorbell business called Ding, which arguably is way more interesting than Ring. But Ring emerged about the same time as Ding was also taking off. And so, of course, from a competition element, they couldn't survive and eventually sold the business. But the fact that there were multiple smart doorbell solutions out there means that now people are kind of used to the idea of a smart doorbell. And they go, okay, I know what this means because I've seen it multiple times. There's there's never kind of just one winner. There is a winner and lots of people with bronze, silver medals.
Yeah, that's a very relevant point. And I think that's part of the, as you said, of building a map of the market, and that you do that by failure more than success. And that's where you can sort of pave the way and show what works and what doesn't. You alluded to a few things I definitely want to dive down. Let's start from your book, Smarter Home. And I think one of the things that I found very interesting on your book is the way that you and correct me if I'm wrong here, of course, but I think you again take a social look at the history of how homes evolved. You made the point where actually a home has never been, as it's not correct, it's not as never been, but in the past, the home was a more of an open place or a public place, maybe because of large families, or it was just more of a, people used to keep the doors open in a village, or it was more a place of interchange. And then suddenly it became more of a closed space, like more of a sanctuary. And now we are sort of opening it up again, but in a kind of a different way. That's one of the things that IoT does. And I found very interesting how this making the home again more public, in this sense, it's not necessarily a good thing, I might say, or it might be used in a different way. And I'm thinking about privacy as a value here. And I think in the past wasn't that valued. We managed to create this value, but is it losing value again? With the fact that technology is getting more and more embedded in everything we do, which implies a lot of information about ourselves get extracted.
So I think the home is a public-private space, always has been in some way. I think our sense of privacy shifts with what kind of home we live in. So if we're in a detached home in the middle of nowhere with lots of woodland around us, then that's, very private, let's say. I live in a Victorian flat. I've got 2 flats below me, a flat above me. If I scream, everyone will hear it, which makes me feel really nice and warm, because if anything ever happens to me and, I've fallen in the bathtub, I can just scream and the neighbors will come around. So I think that there's an illusion of privacy that we want to maintain up to a point. And there is a form of privacy that is very helpful. And then there are forms of privacy that are not very helpful. So, for example, if someone is in a domestic abuse situation and their partner is using smart devices to control the way in which the temperature is, access to the home, access to devices, access to different appliances, that, you sort of want that to not be private, because that's really a terrible situation that's happening somewhere in a home. So I think that negotiation of the public-private is a live conversation and always has been. We, yes, had homes that were a bit more, let's say, by virtue of people working from home and or running their businesses from homes in the Middle Ages, for example. So it was not uncommon for people to have, run a business in the ground floor and then live above it, for example. And then we've kind of gone to, okay, well, maybe you work somewhere else and you commute to that place. And as we know with the pandemic, and you and I are probably sitting in our homes now, we're back to working inside of our homes. And so that negotiation of what we do where and how public or private and or personal versus professional, that is always kind of ebbing and flowing, really.
One of the things I really find fascinating is when I read and your work and now listening to you is the long-term view that you bring. We're going to get back to that. But before getting there, still on your smarter home book and smart home focus, and other things that you touched there that I find interesting. You brought something about outsourcing decisions and hiding complexity. So we kind of move away some of our decision making. I think to what I sometimes hear from designer about the focus is reducing friction. But the point is that friction is not always bad, I think. And I think it gives on us the onus of decision making. And when we remove friction, we are also removing our agency in a sense, because something else is doing that friction instead of us. And looking from IoT, but also with this parallel also today with AI, generative AI, we are outsourcing a lot of decisions to the system using mainly our data in that sense. Do you see these shifts constantly evolving? Is it getting worse, actually, starting from your reflection back in IoT days to in AI? Or actually, do you think it's just, in that sense, is it an historical trend? Or is it something that was always been there, maybe, and we just didn't really notice?
I think we're always exploring how to get more out of doing less, but I think we always stumble into the right solution. So the way I feel about AI, for example, is we're in the middle of treating the general population as a research experiment. because companies haven't exactly figured out why people want to use it. They're putting tools in front of others and just seeing what sticks. And I think people themselves are trying to figure out what sticks by using these tools, which is a classic user research process. Back in the days, if you were making a new fridge, you probably wouldn't give it to the to the entire population to try out. You would do a small trial. You might do, some very close surveys or interviews. You might go to people's homes and do some ethnographic studies, but you would sort of find out as you saw people behave around that new thing. And I think now we're doing the same. We're just doing it at such a scale. And we're weirdly asking people to pay for that research in a way because they're paying for these services. But I think that is that desire to try to shift behavior and try to get people to do things slightly differently has been a major driver of all commerce ever. All commerce is, I'm going to sell you a thing that I think will get you to do this in a way that is deemed slightly more effective. But as I say in the book, if we only had optimization and efficiency in mind, we would all be cooking with a microwave. And none of us would ever be cooking. Because that is technically, back in the 70s, that was a big thing. Technically, you could make any meal in a microwave in under 5 minutes. Whereas actually, as you say, we do like to do some things quite ineffectively, either for pleasure, either for social, either for cultural meaning. There's lots of reasons why we might refuse to take on new forms of technology in our lives. And companies are always trying to figure out where that line is, where they can tip us over the edge, whether it's buying air fryer or it's, buying a blender. There's always that, okay, well, how much efficiency can I sell here versus how much pleasure and friction does someone want to retain?
My impression is that the evolution of technology is forcing us to become more and more aware of that. If we go back in the days and we think about, I don't know, washing machines, they were really, I believe, an act of liberation because it definitely, as far as I understand, it freed up households and in particular women in the household at the time to do things that they couldn't do before because they had to spend most of the time just washing clothes. So I can see where in some situation or at the beginning it became an act of liberation. But now it's maybe liberating us too much. And we need to be conscious of actually, I want to keep doing these things because it's pleasurable, because I want to keep the agency. I want to do it slowly because slow is good. And not everything needs to be done fast or efficiently. And I don't think necessarily most of the people are aware of this choice. And I think that's where I wonder if good design can provide this awareness in some way. I don't know if it's even a conversation maybe in the design world, but I do wonder if it's something that we can help people to. There is a choice here. You can be efficient or you can be aware of the quality of time you're spending doing these things in a different way.
I mean, you can't talk about good design without talking about bad design. That's one of the problems, right? So there's no such thing as a sort of neutral environment where everything can be designed, every bad consequence can be designed out. And I think from research that I did for the book, and I'm sure that stands today, Gen Z, so the youngest population that we have that is out in the world, out of their parents' homes, is now the population that spends the least amount of time in the kitchen. So it's around 7 minutes a day, which means that the engagement with quote unquote traditional heteronormative activities of what happens in the kitchen is changing. And so that social change is leading people to design products that cater to that market and to cater to how those folks are living. And I think that's a natural bend of the design space, is to sort of come into the crevices created by a market opportunity, quote unquote. And I think that's always going to be done. And that's going to be done in sometimes positive ways, sometimes negative ways. So Juicero, for example, for those of you who follow ridiculous Kickstarter campaigns, Juicero was a so-called effective juicer where you would sign up to a bunch of pouches of freshly cut fruit, and the machine would sort of squeeze them for you very effectively within minutes so that you could get every day fresh juice. And it turns out that if you just, put the pouches between two heavy objects, it would do the same. So you didn't need this giant machine that was several hundred pounds. I can't remember how many, in order to do something that, would take you minutes in some other way. So I think this negotiation of where a person in a household needs efficiency and where a person in a household needs care, friction, time. I don't think that we can instrument at large. We can't decide for people. We can't decide where they might need more efficiency and where they might need more time. For someone, it might be to take more time to cook. For someone else, it might be to take more time to rest. And so the amount of time that they spend in the kitchen has to be minimal because actually they have long COVID. They need their rest. They need to sleep more than their counterparts or the people in their household. So nobody should be kind of forced into a design-led view of what a good life is. And that's why design is always so ill-equipped, I think, to tell people how to live. I think people live and then find design solutions to fit their lives, hopefully.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I need to think about that because going back to the earlier point that we were discussing about agency, sometimes it feels like not everyone makes that decision. That's kind of my point. And sometimes it feels that that decision is sort of designed out. Definitely, at least in the digital experience, that decision making is sort of like it's really designed out so that people don't even remember anymore. I could make a decision about that. And I think that's where I do wonder if there are things we can do. So let me stay on this topic, but I want to reference another piece of work you did back in the days that I find very interesting, and I think is related to that. And I wonder if there are broader applications. I'm referring to the work you did with Better IoT, I think that was was called, which in the way I understand it, it was a checklist to help founders or anyone building a new IoT product to make decisions about how to design this product. So is it practically possible to build an ethical, resilient, and repairable smart device and smart home as a whole today? Is it a realistic and practical target we can achieve?
I mean, nothing that's hard is ever realistic in the beginning, right? It's all about ambition. So Better IoT, betteriot.org, was a community effort that initially started in 2012. Usman Haq asked me to help him organize an event called the Open and Internet of Things Assembly. We gathered to talk about what open source and open principles and ethics meant at the time in 2012, which is in the very beginning, really, of the sort of hype curve of IoT, even if the term had been coined by Kevin Ashton in 2001, in the UK at least, between 2011 and 2015, that was just a lot of activity. I held this event and started talking about kind of broad principles. I revisited the event 5 years later, so in 2017, and we held an event where we decided, okay, well, let's see if we can actually develop a certification scheme for ethical IoT products. So initially, it was meant to be certification. And what we found out as we started looking at, okay, well, what would you say is certifiable? What would be in? What would be out? What would you impose? The very nature of things is that they're all different. The contexts of use are all different, and it depends. And so what we ended up kind of veering towards is a questionnaire instead of a certification scheme. So free questionnaire that gave people some sense of some of the decisions that they are maybe not taking right now, maybe should be taking. And the answers to the questions on the questionnaire are yes, no, not sure, not right now. Because some of these things, people are just, it's in the pipeline for later. It's a nice to have feature. We think maybe in the future, but we're not sure. But at least we wanted to make sure that they sort of thought about it. And so there are about, I think, 30 or 40 questions. They address privacy, they address security, they address repairability, they address data governance, all sorts of aspects of IoT that we thought at least people should be thinking about when they're starting a company and not just sort of skipping over and saying, I don't need to think about this right now. So that questionnaire is still up. It's under the IoT.London website, and you can find it there, or you can go to betteriot.org, which will redirect you. And I still think even today that questionnaire still stands and it's still useful.
And I feel the application should be broader than that. As you hear a lot of people talking about ethical AI and so forth nowadays in AI. So I think there are broader application of certifying something to make sure, it's done and it's designed and built in a certain way.
Just pointing to another piece of work I did during the pandemic called humanvalues.io. This was done with the BBC R&D, and this also ended up being a 72 question questionnaire for digital folks. And so for folks building online solutions. And at the time, the BBC R&D North Lab, led by Bill Thompson and others, was really looking at, well, what are the, how do we respect some key human values that they had identified, which included, some sense of safety, security, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the same principles, but for the digital world. And we still ended up with a really what I think is still an interesting questionnaire. So that also people can find at humanvalues.io. And I think those questions are still valid. They're still valid even if we're in a sort of no man's land of AI solutions. There are some clear questions one should be asking.
Absolutely. And thanks for providing all these links. I'm going to put all the links in the description of the podcast for anyone who's interested to follow up and actually go down. I know there are a lot of builders and designers and technologists and innovators among the listeners. So sounds like these can be tools for them. So I'd like to shift to a few things actually alluded that to me are relevant. It's a lens, at least I picked up originally in your book, Smart Homes, is also a lens that I pick up in sort of later work you have been doing on climate change. I'm thinking also about the Low Carbon Design Institute, from the lens of one of my favorite innovators was Stuart Brand, which I know you referenced to, especially the change layers. Interestingly enough, also, just the last couple of weeks when I contacted you for the interviews and we started preparing the interviews, I did listen to his interview at one of my favorite podcasts, which is the Sean Carroll's podcast. And he's talking about his last book that actually just bought and I'm reading, which is The Maintenance of Everything. And there is a strong connection here. And if I have to look at your work, one of the things I notice is that you have this long-term thinking, as I mentioned, which interestingly enough also connect to other Stuart Brand work like the Clock of the Long Now. And I also always feel you are one of those innovators that don't necessarily fall in love for what you might call the day one. Like, we created this thing and we launched it, but you have this long view about how these things looks like after day 1 million, and which is about maintenance, repairability, the long-term impact, which is, I believe, first and foremost, a social impact. The CO2 impact is a social impact. If I'm looking to the sort of, I think it's the Native Americans look of the, I think, was it 5 generation? Any decisions that the tribe needs to think about 5 generations down, something like that. And I think that's where innovation should also be about, not just the next shiny thing, which is sometimes too technological, but also the social impact, which are much longer term. And it's something that takes more time to think.
I think I look at things in terms of consequences. So I don't believe that you can live without looking at the consequences of your actions. And I think a lot of entrepreneurship and a lot of Silicon Valley thinking likes to adopt, and maybe a lot of designers like to adopt this idea that they come in, they create from scratch, they innovate from scratch. Nothing was ever there before, nothing will be there after. And I like to take a more longitudinal perspective, because I think everybody has to live with the consequences of other people's design work from decades ago. I live with the consequences of someone's design work when they design a staircase that's slightly too low or slightly too high at my local train stations. I have to be there kind of huffing and puffing, up a difficult staircase because of someone's design decisions decades ago. So I think we have to think about those things. I don't know if I think about them more than most people. Maybe I do. Maybe I like history and I like looking at the consequences that we live with today because of historical actions. Maybe that then helps me see or think about the future. But I think living in an unconsequential mind frame is acting like a child. I think only children act that way. And I think we're grown-ups. So why not think about the consequences and the spillover effects of our actions? Some people in the, other spheres of design, whether that's speculative design or futurists, will use, consequence scanning as a technique very often. And I think it's not unusual, but yes, certainly it's something I always keep in mind.
I love these mention of consequences and consequences of design. There are a couple of directions here that I think are relevant. One direction is, again, looking at the long view. You alluded to that earlier about the smart homes, talking about electricity or many other technologies, which is there is a technological change, which might be per se relatively quick, but there is a social change that comes with that, which is often generational. I think it connects to your consequence problem, but how do you combine the two? Because earlier you also used the word hype, the hype of IoT. And there is this hype, which is great and cool and everyone want to do it, but actually the social consequences of whatever you're doing, you might gonna see them 20 years down the line. So how do you connect this bridge?
I think ironically, I don't think you wait 20 years. I think you just wait 6 months, because as soon as more than a certain kind of person uses your technology, your invention, innovation, you'll see the consequences. And again, I come back to something quite sad, but I think domestic violence is an example of a short-sighted view of what a user, quote unquote, user customer might do with the product. And I think most people in their brainstorming, their initial profiling of customers always have this sort of rose-tinted glasses of what people's intentions are. And sometimes people have bad intentions. So I really don't think you need to wait too long. But usually when you don't think of it to begin with, have a rose-tinted view of users, then yeah, shit hits the fan, excuse my French, very, very quickly. And I think that's really the, bread and butter of journalism these days, is seeing people live with the consequences of their actions all the time, at an innovation level, at a social level. It's all of that.
Yeah. And I think it's probably goes back again to what you said earlier about being an adult and being able to actually be interested in the consequences and be able to say, okay, I can do a better work here instead of just focusing on the shiny, okay, I launched the new things and it has market uptake and not looking at, all the different elements which are part of your work.
Just to dig into that for a second, I think if you had to get, down to brass tacks with it, or really think, what does this mean? What does my comment mean in this context? Most people don't develop a risk register when they are building a business. They don't think, well, what could happen that goes wrong, and what am I going to do, and how likely is this thing that goes wrong? That's a risk register. And I think that's the thing that kind of is put in your face when you take public money. So if you apply for public funding, you have to design your risk register even in your application for funding. If you're taking VC money, no such thing. Someone will just sort of go, here's, 5 million, go nuts for the next 3 years. Let's see what you can do. Nobody's sitting there going, well, have you really thought of the negative consequences of this on the most vulnerable of your user base? Are you prepared with good PR in case something goes terribly wrong? What will you do if this is taken over by, some terrible government that wants to control your user base? These things don't necessarily belong to the world of private finance in terms of conversations, whereas they do absolutely belong to the world of public finance.
Ooh, that's a very interesting point. It could be, in my mind, could be a whole podcast interview only about that. Personally, I always saw innovation as a risk management and investment management exercise that we do as a society, by the way. Not you can do it as a single institution, as a VC, or as a state, or as a society. And of course, in a risk management, investment management, the risk register should be the first thing. But yeah, I completely agree with you. There is disconnect, in particular from finance and VC, to the impacts on societies. And it's just like, this is a financial instrument, isn't it? And if it goes from their perspective, if any of those risks happen, they just lost the 5 million investment of their 5 billion bucket. And that's it. The fact that maybe people get hurt or harmed out of that is just an externality. Topic that I know you touched and I find very relevant. I touched earlier about the last book about Stuart Brand is maintenance. We tend to design nowadays for customer delight. I think this way. We don't design for maintenance anymore. This repairability is okay. If these things is really delighting you, you might want to keep it forever. How do you fix it? Can we still make things that last? And people can fix and have the knowledge to fix? And is the problem purely a design problem, or it also became a social problem? Because I'm thinking about my granddad. Well, he used to keep everything because he could fix anything. So it's like, okay, I'm going to keep that thing over there because if I need it, I can fix it and use it again. We just don't do that because, yeah, probably if I look at 90% of the stuff that he left there and sometimes I have to clean up, I can't fix it, really. That's the reason, because I clean it up. I just can't fix it. I don't know how to do it. And I feel I'm not alone. Hopefully, maybe I am in this struggle for fixing things. And so how are we evolving? Is it a social problem? Is it a design problem? Or how we come about to go back to maintainability and repairability? Because I strongly believe this is going to be key in the climate change work. If you keep throwing stuff away, the impact is going to be huge. There's no other consequence, I believe.
I mean, this is also a 3-hour conversation, right? I was a trustee for the Restart Project. The Restart Project is a right to repair campaign organization. And the right to repair is a EU law that the Restart Project are trying to get into the UK as a UK law. And it looks at asking organizations to make objects more repairable by more people, i.e. repairability that is accessible to end consumers as opposed to accessible to repair shops necessarily, which is currently the state of repair. You ask whether we can ever go back. We can never go back. I think we should absolutely avoid unhelpful nostalgia, and helpful nostalgia gets us into all sorts of trouble. But we should look at whether things are in fact both disassemblable quite easily, repairable if possible, and we should make it at least something that is accessible. Doesn't mean that everybody will want to do it. I also believe that the time that it takes to repair, the craft required to learn to repair something because you've done it over and over again, belongs and is sort of slowly starting to belong to the endangered craft register eventually, I think. There is such a thing in the UK as the endangered craft register. I think we'll get to a point where repairing things will become an endangered skill. But for the people who are capable of doing it, who are on our high streets all the time, we have to make it easier for them to repair things for us. And therefore, the objects themselves have to be repairable. Can't be full of glue. The enclosure has to be openable. There has to be a way in that doesn't corrupt the object once it's been repaired, so it just isn't you can't put it back together again. All these things I think are really easy design decisions that unfortunately most organizations don't want to invest in. And they don't want to invest in it because it helps their bottom line, which I understand. You cannot sell 12 toasters in the life of a person if all of those toasters are repairable. In the good old days, whenever those were, you might have sold them one. You're not going to build a global business selling someone something once. And we've known that for almost 150 years now, since that wheel started, really. So I think if there's no going back, at least we have to move forward to giving ourselves a chance, and a chance at things being repairable. They might not be repaired, but at least they must be repairable.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And I understand, definitely, I might brought a bit of that nostalgia in my question, but I may be just getting old. But I think, yeah, I do understand the value of repairability as a concept, which we are losing. Again, as a personal anecdote, just some time ago, I probably should have checked the YouTube video, but I wanted by myself do something with the Apple AirTag. I opened it the wrong way. It just unglued the cover. There was no way to make it work again. Just by ungluing the cover, it needed to be thrown. And I checked afterwards and for the YouTube, but it was the case. I'm like, it's just a cover. Why, if you took it out, the system doesn't work anymore? Looks bad design to me. But it goes back to your point: is well, then I'm going to buy a new AirTag. So for their bottom line, it's much better to act that way. And I think that's where, going back to your point of public investment versus private investment, public investment and the right to repairability, as far as I can see, is a public investment or public policies where the right decisions can be made and the right demands can be asked to companies. That's a very relevant point. I think we got to the end of this fantastic conversation. So I close with the last question that I ask all my guests. And so, what are the characteristics for you of leader who embraces complexity?
I think openness and curiosity, it's a bit of a trite answer, but I think it means something quite deep to me. I think the ability and the interests that I have are varied. I've brought this into every business I've ever worked in, and it's made, I think, a difference for people to know that I read widely, have a wide set of interests, have a wide understanding of the sector, have a wide understanding of its political dynamics, and all of that I think you have to actively maintain in the 21st century, where it is so easy to know a million things in a very shallow way. And I think you don't have to know a million things in a very shallow way. I think you can know 20 or 30 things, but in a slightly deeper way. And I think that anchors your practice, it anchors your knowledge base, and it makes that knowledge base grow over time. Yeah, that's a bit of an abstract, maybe complex answer, but maybe that's okay.
It's absolutely okay. I think in managing complexity is all about leadership, and you're still a leader in your field. And I think it's really about what are the tools that you use or you think are worth. And I can relate a lot to that. And I think it's very interesting because, yeah, listening to you, what I was connecting actually was the previous conversation about that long view that you definitely bring on that sort of historical view on the past, but also that sort of generational view of the consequences and of whatever you are working on in the future. It sounds like you added a few other dimensions around breadth and depth also in that point of view of not just focusing on the thing, but understanding the context. And I think, yeah, that's very valuable. I can see a lot of people nowadays just becoming super deep in whatever they're doing and missing that openness, as you said, and curiosity about, okay, that thing is going to fit into a broader world. And don't you want to know how that broader world works and how it connects to all the other parts? And I think that's very powerful. So thanks a lot. Alex gave us a lot of references, a lot of interesting projects now we have to dig into. And of course, also referring to your first book you wrote. I understand correctly that you also plan to publish a new one in the future on similar topics.
So I've written 3 books now, and I'm working on the second edition of Smarter Homes. Yeah, that hopefully will be out this year.
Okay, great. So I suggest everyone, you might have a look to the first version, which I did, and it's still very good. And then maybe also see what changes in the new one, and a lot of references that you gave us today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.